The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the streets are lined with trimmed hedges and the houses all carry the same look of stability. To an outsider, nothing seems unusual here. Families take evening walks, kids ride their bikes, and neighbors exchange polite waves. But behind one set of heavy wooden doors, the atmosphere was different, fragile, charged with unspoken words, and quietly building towards something no one in that community would see coming. The man at the center of it all was in his late 60s, a tall figure with a presence that drew attention even in silence. His skin, dark and weathered by years of hard work, contrasted with the crisp white shirts he favored. He was known in the neighborhood as polite, respectful, and almost too private. People often wondered about him, but he gave little away. He lived alone in a large two-story house with a spacious yard that seemed too much for one person to manage, yet he always kept it neat. Behind that carefully maintained exterior was a life full of battles, sacrifices, and secrets that few people understood. The young woman who shared his home had a very different energy. She was in her 20s, sharp-tongued, restless, and impatient with almost everything around her. Neighbors caught glimpses of her pulling into the driveway with music blasting or slamming the door behind her after arguments that carried out into the street. To them, she looked like a daughter rebelling against her father, nothing more than the usual tension between generations. What they didn't know was that their bond wasn't by blood. It was through adoption, a choice he made years ago that reshaped both of their lives. On the surface, their days followed a normal rhythm. She worked odd jobs, drifting between commitments, always looking for something bigger, but never quite settling. He, retired now, kept to his routine of early mornings, quiet afternoons, and evenings spent in the solitude of his study. But under that ordinary schedule lay cracks that grew wider with each passing week. The arguments were becoming sharper, the silences colder, and the respect between them had begun to wither away. The tension often revolved around money, though neither of them spoke about it directly. She accused him of holding her back, of clinging to old-fashioned values that had no place in her world. He reminded her of the roof over her head, of the food she never had to pay for, of the years he had poured into giving her chances she might not have had otherwise. To outsiders, these disagreements seemed small, the sort of friction most families dealt with. But inside that house the words carried weight. Resentment simmered, fueled by pride and the feeling of being misunderstood. The young woman carried her anger like a badge, letting it shape her every interaction. To her, he was a man stuck in his ways, someone who refused to see her potential or treat her like an equal. She believed he controlled her, that every gesture of care was just another chain disguised as love. But what she didn't see was the other side of his silence, the way his eyes lingered when she stormed out, the quiet sighs he let slip when he thought no one was listening. He was a man who had given more than most would ever know, and who carried a secret burden that made every conflict heavier than it seemed. Their home became a battlefield of small moments, dinner plates left untouched, doors slammed late at night, short, clipped exchanges that left both of them raw. And yet, there were also quieter moments, brief sparks of normalcy, where they laughed over a memory or shared a television show. Those moments only made the tension worse, because they reminded both of them that things hadn't always been this way. Beneath the surface, deeper issues pulsed like an unseen current. Power, control, pride. Each played a role in shaping the fragile dynamic. She wanted freedom, independence, and recognition, while he wanted respect, gratitude, and peace. Both were stubborn, both unwilling to bend, and both carrying wounds that neither had the courage to voice. To the outside world, nothing seemed broken, but inside that house the air was heavy, as if something inevitable was approaching. The man, quiet as always, kept his thoughts locked away in journals and locked drawers. The young woman, fiery and restless, plotted her escape from a life she thought was holding her down. What neither of them realized was that the decisions they made in that house would reach far beyond their walls, unraveling truths that had been carefully hidden for years. The stage was set long before the final ACT. A man with too many secrets, a woman with too much anger, a fragile relationship built on sacrifice and expectations that were never truly spoken aloud. All it would take was one breaking point, one final push, to shatter the silence and expose everything that had been waiting underneath. The breaking point didn't come in one sudden burst. It was slow, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Day by day, the silence in the house stretched longer, and the arguments that did erupt became sharper, more dangerous in their edges. What began as small disagreements over chores or bills turned into accusations about worth, about sacrifices unrecognized, about debts that could never be repaid. The young woman felt trapped. She looked at her friends who had apartments of their own, freedom to make mistakes without judgment, and she burned with jealousy. To her, every rule her adoptive father enforced, the curfews, the lectures about saving money, the constant reminders of what he had done for her, felt like chains. She wanted her own life, a chance to prove herself, but the reality was that she wasn't ready. She struggled to keep jobs, lived beyond her means, and leaned on him more than she would admit. That imbalance fueled her anger. She saw his steady, measured ways not as guidance, but as control. For him, the frustration grew heavier with every passing week. He had raised her with discipline and sacrifice, poured everything into giving her chances she never would have had. He believed in hard work, in patience, in gratitude. But the more he reminded her of what he had done, the more she pulled away. What hurt most was not her disrespect, but the coldness, the refusal to see him as anything other than an obstacle. He had faced the world alone for so many years before he adopted her, and now he wondered if all those sacrifices had been wasted. The first sharp fracture came one summer evening. She had come home late, the smell of alcohol lingering on her clothes, her eyes blazing with defiance. He was waiting in the living room, sitting stiff in his armchair. When he asked where she had been, she laughed, mocking his concern, telling him she wasn't a child anymore. He reminded her it was his house, his rules. She snapped back that maybe she didn't want his house anymore. Those words landed heavier than she realized, and though he didn't respond, the look in his eyes said everything. Something in their bond had shifted that night, and it couldn't be undone. Money became the battlefield soon after. She wanted more of it. Fancy clothes, expensive outings, a lifestyle she couldn't maintain. He refused to fund it. He offered her structure, a plan to save, to build stability, but she heard only rejection. Resentment grew into something deeper. She began to see him as selfish, as a man clinging to money he didn't deserve. He never flaunted wealth, never even hinted at it. But in her eyes, his refusal to indulge her proved he had more than he let on. She started to believe he was hoarding it, keeping it from her, just to watch her struggle. The whispers of the outside world didn't help. Friends questioned why she still lived under her father's roof. Some mocked her dependence, others fed her resentment, telling her she deserved more. Every word she heard outside the house twisted her perception inside it. Instead of seeing him as a man who had saved her, she began to see him as the reason she wasn't free. He felt those changes, though she never spoke them aloud. He noticed the way her eyes lingered on his study, where he kept his locked drawers. He saw the way she pressed him about finances, about whether he had savings. He could sense her distrust, her growing distance, and yet he never explained the truth he was hiding. Behind that quiet exterior, he carried knowledge of a fortune, millions carefully tucked away, money he never spoke of. He believed wealth was meant to be earned, not handed over. And so he kept it secret, waiting for the right time, if such a time would ever come. But secrets weigh heavy. She grew restless with suspicion, and he grew silent with disappointment. Their confrontations became more physical, her slamming doors, shoving past him, screaming words she could never take back. His response was always calm, too calm, and that infuriated her even more. His restraint, his refusal to break, made her feel powerless. And in her mind, power was all that mattered. The past played a role too. She remembered growing up, the way other kids looked at her when they learned she was adopted. Some whispered that she didn't belong, others pitied her. Those memories burned inside her, feeding her belief that she was living a life borrowed from someone else's charity. He tried to remind her that family wasn't blood, that love was proven in action, but she never truly accepted it. Somewhere deep inside, she carried a wound that told her she would always be second best, always unwanted unless she fought for more. For him, the past was full of sacrifices he never spoke of. He had known poverty, the kind that left him hungry as a child, the kind that taught him to count every coin. He had fought to build the life he had now, piece by piece, with no help from anyone. That was why he guarded his money, why he hid it, because he knew how fragile security really was. He had thought raising her would give him purpose, that his sacrifices would mean something when she grew into her own life. But now, as their fights grew darker, he questioned whether love could ever bridge the gap between expectation and reality. The turning point came in the fall, during another argument about money. She demanded he help her with a loan for a car she couldn't afford. He refused. His voice was steady, but his words cut deep. "You need to learn to stand on your own." To her, it wasn't advice. It was rejection. She screamed back that he was keeping her small, that he enjoyed watching her fail. For the first time, his calm broke. He raised his voice, his hands slamming against the table, his eyes burning with a fury she had never seen. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. They looked at each other like strangers, and in that moment, both knew there was no going back. The weeks that followed were unbearable. She avoided him, spending nights away, returning only to grab clothes or demand small amounts of money. He withdrew further into himself, locking his study when he left the room, guarding his journals and his secrets more closely. The house felt colder, emptier, as though even the walls had taken sides. But under the tension, darker emotions stirred. She started to imagine what life would be like without him. What if she had the house to herself, the money she was sure he was hiding? The thought grew into an obsession. She began snooping, checking drawers, watching his routines carefully. He noticed, though he never confronted her directly. Instead, he grew more protective, retreating further into silence. Inside both of them, internal struggles raged. She felt torn between guilt and anger, between knowing he had given her everything and believing he owed her more. He battled with disappointment and sorrow, torn between wanting to protect her and fearing what she was becoming. Each carried their pain like a shadow, unseen but always present, pulling them closer to the edge. Every moment between them now carried weight. A glance at dinner, a slammed door at midnight, a conversation cut short by silence. It was all building, piece by piece, toward the breaking point neither could avoid. And though neither of them knew it, the truth about what he had been hiding, the millions he had quietly protected for decades, was about to become the fuel that turned their fragile world into a battlefield. The night it happened was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses against the chest, making every breath feel too loud. Rain had been falling for hours, soft at first, then harder, until the roof rattled with the weight of it. The house, dimly lit and cold, felt smaller than usual, as though its walls were closing in on them both. She had been pacing for most of the evening, her footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. He sat in his study, the yellow glow of a desk lamp spilling over his papers. The door between them was more than just wood. It was a barrier, a reminder of all the secrets and refusals that had shaped their lives together. She couldn't take it anymore. When she finally pushed the door open, she didn't knock. Her face was flushed, her jaw tight, her hands trembling though she tried to hide it. He didn't look up right away, just kept his eyes on the open ledger before him. That calmness, that refusal to acknowledge her storm, broke something in her. "You've been lying to me," she said, her voice cracking. He lifted his head, his expression unreadable. About everything," she shouted. "The money, the way you treat me, the way you keep me here like I'm a child. I know you have it. You've been hiding it all along." His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to sorrow. "That money is not yours," he said softly. Those words were gasoline. She had suspected, had pieced together small clues, but hearing him admit it, even in that guarded way, ignited all her resentment at once. She stepped closer, her fists clenched. "Not mine? After everything? After the years I've wasted in this house? You think you get to decide what I deserve?" He stood slowly, his height towering over her, his presence filling the room. His voice rose now, firm and heavy. "You are not owed anything. I gave you a home. I gave you a life you would not have had. And you stand here, spitting on it like it means nothing." The rain outside beat harder against the windows, drowning the silence that followed. Her heart pounded so violently she could hear it in her ears. In that moment, she wasn't just a daughter arguing with a father. She was a woman staring at the person she believed had stolen her freedom, her future, her worth. And he, in his grief and anger, saw a daughter who had turned into a stranger. Something inside her snapped. Her eyes darted to the heavy brass paperweight on his desk. It gleamed in the lamplight, harmless in its usual place, but now it looked like a weapon. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. He saw it. His voice broke into a desperate plea, sharp but shaken. "Don't!" But she did. The weight of it in her hand was shocking, cold, solid, final. The first blow came with a sickening sound, and his gasp filled the room. His knees buckled, his body collapsing against the desk before crashing to the floor. She froze, staring down at him, her breath jagged, her eyes wide. The world seemed to tilt, the edges of her vision blurring. He wasn't gone at once. He looked up at her, blood seeping from his temple, his lips parting as though to say something. There was no anger in his eyes, no hatred, only sorrow. That look undid her more than any word could. She raised the paperweight again, driven by panic, by fear, by the twisted belief that she had to finish what she started. The second blow silenced him. When the room fell still, she dropped the paperweight, the clang of it against the floor echoing through the house. The rain outside kept falling, steady and relentless, as if the world hadn't noticed what had just been done. Her body shook uncontrollably. Her hands, her clothes. Everything was stained. She stumbled back, pressing against the wall, trying to breathe, trying to understand what she had done. Her chest ached with a wild rhythm of adrenaline and terror. She whispered to herself, "It wasn't supposed to be like this," over and over, as though the words could undo the reality in front of her. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. She crouched beside him, her fingers trembling as she pressed against his neck, searching for something she already knew wasn't there. His skin was cooling, his eyes empty. Denial rushed in to smother the horror. She told herself she had no choice, that he pushed her, that he never gave her the life she deserved. She clung to those thoughts like a lifeline, because the truth, that she had killed the only person who ever truly cared for her, was unbearable. The panic turned quickly into calculation. Her eyes darted around it, D, the study, the drawers, the papers, the locked box in the corner. She knew she couldn't call for help. She told herself she had to survive now, to take what he'd kept from her. If she left him there, if she walked away, then maybe it wouldn't feel like murder. Maybe it would just feel like freedom. She grabbed the keys from his pocket, her fingers slipping in the blood, and unlocked the drawers he had guarded so closely. Inside, she found files, ledgers, bank statements that confirmed everything she suspected. Millions, more than she could even imagine, hidden away in careful accounts. Her breath caught, a mix of awe and disgust. He had kept it from her all this time. She convinced herself it was proof he never trusted her, proof he never intended to share. That lie, that betrayal, became the only justification she had left. The house smelled of iron and rain, the quiet broken only by her shallow breathing. She packed what she could, stuffing documents and valuables into a bag, her hands still slick with the evidence of what she had done. Every movement felt unreal, like she was watching someone else act out a nightmare. But when she caught her reflection in the mirror above his desk, she saw the truth. Her own eyes staring back at her, wild, broken, unrecognizable. The aftermath was chaos contained in silence. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She moved with the cold focus of someone who had crossed a line and knew there was no way back. But inside, her chest ached with regret, with fragments of memories, his laugh when she was a child, the way he held her hand when she was scared, the sacrifices she had once recognized but long since forgotten. They flickered through her mind like cruel reminders, and for a fleeting moment she almost collapsed under the weight of them. Then she shut it all out. By the time she left the study, locking the door behind her, the house had returned to its eerie stillness. Only the rain bore witness to what had happened. She walked past the photos on the wall, past the echoes of years that would now never return. And though her steps were quick, her heart knew she could never truly leave what she had done behind. The crime had unfolded in passion, in rage, but its shadow was long. She had killed not just a man, not just a father, but the fragile bond that tied her to any sense of love or belonging. And though she told herself she was free now, that the money would give her the life she deserved, the truth lingered in the back of her mind. Freedom built on blood was no freedom at all. The morning after the crime, the rain had stopped, but the house carried a stillness that felt unnatural. The young woman woke with her heart pounding, her mind fighting to believe the night before had been nothing more than a nightmare. But when she stepped into the hallway, the silence told the truth. The study door, locked from the outside, was a barrier between her and the reality of what she had done. Every creak of the floor beneath her feet was a reminder that the man who had once filled the house with steady presence was gone. At first, denial took over. She told herself he would have died eventually. He was old, frail compared to her youth. She whispered lies to herself, saying she hadn't meant to hurt him, that it was only anger, only a moment she couldn't control. She convinced herself that the money, what she found in his drawers, the papers proving his hidden wealth, was rightfully hers. She said it enough times that for a few hours she almost believed it. But guilt is not so easily silenced. Every sound unsettled her. The dripping faucet in the kitchen, the wind pushing against the windows, the faint tick of the Sioux lock in the hallway. Each noise pulled her back to the image of him lying on the floor, his eyes dimming, his blood spreading across the wooden boards. She washed her hands over and over, but the stains didn't leave her mind. As hours turned into days, she struggled to maintain a facade. Neighbors began to notice. They saw her leaving the house at odd hours, looking pale and nervous. Some asked where her father was, and she gave quick, sharp answers. "He's away," or "He's resting." The more she spoke those lies, the more suspicious her tone became. People who had once dismissed their arguments as typical family tension now began to wonder if something darker lingered behind those closed doors. The community, once indifferent, started whispering. They had always respected him. He was the quiet man who never caused trouble, who kept his lawn neat, who nodded politely, but never meddled. Now, his absence was glaring. For a man so steady in his routines, vanishing without a word seemed impossible. The contrast between his reputation and the daughter's restless, defiant nature made people uneasy. They began to see her not as a struggling young woman, but as someone unpredictable, unstable. Inside, she battled herself. At night, she replayed the crime in her head, seeing every detail, the weight of the paperweight in her hand, the sound of his voice pleading that last word, "Don't." She tried to drown it out with music, with alcohol, with anything that could keep her from thinking. But the memories returned with sharper edges each time. She began justifying her actions more forcefully. She told herself he had been cruel, that he never trusted her, that he had hidden a fortune from her, as though she weren't worthy. In her mind, he had forced her hand, pushed her to that breaking point. But underneath the bravado was fear. She couldn't shake the knowledge that she had destroyed the only person who had stood by her when no one else would. The psychological toll ate away at her. She stopped eating properly, lost weight, and her eyes grew hollow. Friends noticed the change, but when they asked what was wrong, she snapped at them, claiming she was fine. No one believed her. Some distanced themselves, uneasy with the dark energy that now seemed to follow her. The legal consequences began to close in soon after. A missing persons report was filed by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen the old man in weeks. Police knocked on the door, their questions polite at first, but probing. She told them he was traveling, but they noticed her nervous hands, her trembling voice. The study remained locked, and though they didn't push immediately, suspicion grew. When word spread, the media caught hold of the story. Headlines painted two clashing portraits, the respected, hard-working father who had raised a child not his own, and the troubled daughter who had grown increasingly volatile. Neighbors gave interviews about the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the nights she sped away in her car. The community that once turned a blind eye to the cracks in their relationship now turned them into spectacle. The father, in their eyes, became a tragic figure, a man betrayed by the very person he had tried to save. For the daughter, the weight of public perception was crushing. She read the headlines, saw the pictures of herself pulled from social media, and realized she was no longer anonymous. She was the villain of the story, the ungrateful child who had everything and destroyed it all. The more the world painted her as a monster, the harder she clung to her own twisted version of events. She told herself she had been pushed, that she was the real victim, but deep down, her guilt bled through every thought. The study, where his body still lay hidden, became unbearable to walk past. The smell, faint at first, began to seep in to the house. She burned candles, opened windows, tried to mask it, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Eventually, the walls could no longer keep the secret. The police returned, more insistent this time. They forced their way into the locked room, and the truth spilled into the open. The sight of his body, long decayed by then, sent shockwaves through the community. The house, once ordinary, became a crime scene swarming with officers, cameras, and reporters. Neighbors stood in the street, horrified but unable to look away. The image of the quiet man, the adoptive father who had sacrificed everything, contrasted sharply with the young woman being led away in handcuffs, her face pale and blank, as though she had already left herself behind. For her, the aftermath was no longer about denial. It was about survival. The courtroom became her new battlefield, her defense built on excuses and half-truths. She claimed abuse, claimed manipulation, claimed desperation. But the evidence told a different story. The bloodstains, the weapon, the financial documents she had stolen, all painted her as not only guilty, but calculated. The emotional toll on the wider circle was devastating. Extended relatives of the father, though distant, mourned the man they knew as selfless and hard-working. Friends spoke of his generosity, his quiet strength, his decision to adopt a child and give her a life she might never have had. Their grief was tangled with disbelief. How could the daughter he raised turn on him in such a brutal way? In the end, the community saw the crime not just as a tragedy of one family, but as a reminder of how fragile relationships can be. Love, sacrifice, and trust had been twisted into resentment, greed, and betrayal. The young woman, once seen as rebellious but harmless, became a warning of how anger, when left to fester, could destroy everything in its path. And for her, locked away with nothing but her thoughts, the aftermath was worse than the crime itself. The silence of the cell echoed louder than the silence of the house had ever been. Each night when she closed her eyes, she saw his face again, not in anger, not in rage, but in sorrow. That look, the one he gave her with his last breath, was the punishment she could never escape. The trial that followed was long and grueling, drawing both local and national attention. Every detail of the crime was pulled apart in the courtroom, every aspect of their relationship laid bare for strangers to examine. The prosecution painted the daughter as cold and calculating, a young woman driven by greed and entitlement, willing to destroy the very man who had sacrificed everything for her. The defense tried to soften her image, portraying her as overwhelmed, trapped, and desperate, but the evidence was unshakable. The paperweight, the bank documents, the lies she told neighbors and police, all of it spoke louder than her words. When the verdict finally came, the weight of it silenced the room. Guilty. The sentence was long enough to take away her youth, her freedom, her chance at a future outside prison walls. As the judge read the punishment, she stood expressionless, her face a mask that revealed nothing. But those who had watched her through the trial knew the truth. Her bravado had cracked, leaving behind a hollow shell of a young woman who had gambled everything and lost. Justice, in the eyes of the law, was served. A man's life had been taken, and his killer would pay. But justice in the deeper sense was more complicated. Nothing could return the years he had spent raising her, the love he had given, or the life he had built with his own hands. For those who had known him, the sentence was a poor exchange for his absence. He had been a father, a neighbor, a quiet force of Stabi, Lighty, and now he was reduced to headlines and court transcripts. For the community, the story lingered like a scar. People spoke about it for months, then years, using it as a cautionary tale. Parents looked at their children differently, wondering if love was enough to protect against resentment and anger. Neighbors whispered about the fragility of trust, how a family that looked ordinary from the outside could collapse so violently behind closed doors. His house, once a symbol of steadiness, became an empty shell, eventually sold, but never fully freed from the shadow of what had happened inside. The public backlash against the young woman was fierce. She was labeled ungrateful, selfish, cruel. The media called her the daughter who betrayed her father, the girl who traded love for money. Few tried to understand the complexity of her actions, the mixture of resentment, desperation, and anger that had driven her to the breaking point. To most, she was simply a villain, a reminder of how entitlement could twist into destruction. Yet beneath the outrage, the story revealed uncomfortable truths about society. It exposed how money can corrode relationships, how secrets meant to protect can instead breed suspicion. It highlighted the difficult balance of power in families, especially in those shaped not by blood, but by choice. His decision to adopt her had been an act of love, but it also carried unspoken expectations, gratitude, respect, loyalty. When those expectations went unmet, disappointment turned to conflict, and conflict turned to tragedy. On a deeper level, the case raised questions about morality and human behavior. Was she born ungrateful, Or was she shaped by years of feeling misunderstood and lesser than those around her? Was he wrong to keep his wealth hidden, believing she needed to earn her way? Or was that his right as someone who had worked for it? There were no easy answers. Both had carried wounds, his from a life of struggle, hers from a sense of abandonment and resentment she never overcame. Their inability to bridge that gap, to speak honestly about love and pain, had left them both vulnerable to the worst parts of themselves. In prison, her story did not fade. Reporters occasionally revisited the case, fascinated by the contrast between her youth and the brutality of her crime. For her, the walls became a constant reminder of the choices she had made. At night, she replayed the moment over and over, the paperweight in her hand, his final look of sorrow. It haunted her more than the sentence itself, because deep down she knew no punishment could match the weight of that memory. For him, though gone, his legacy lived in whispers. Neighbors remembered his quiet strength, his sacrifices, his patience. They spoke of him not as a victim of a violent crime, but as a man who had done his best in a world that often gave him little. His fortune, once hidden, was revealed in court documents, shocking many who had seen him live modestly. It became a point of debate. Some saw it as proof of his humility, others as a secret that fueled the tragedy. But whatever opinions were voiced, none could deny that he had lived with dignity, even if his life ended without it. The broader impact of the crime stretched beyond one house or one family. It touched on universal questions about gratitude, obligation, and the fragile balance between independence and dependence in family life. It showed how easily resentment could grow in silence, how quickly anger could turn into violence when left unchecked. And it reminded people that even in ordinary homes, with ordinary lives, darkness can take root if love is buried beneath pride and misunderstanding. In the end, the story was not just about a daughter who killed her father, or about millions hidden away in secret accounts. It was about the human struggle between love and control, between giving and taking, between sacrifice and resentment. It was about how people fail each other, not always through malice, but through silence, through the inability to bridge the distance between what is given and what is expected in return. The daughter would spend the rest of her life defined by that one night, her name forever tied to betrayal and greed. The father, remembered in contrast, would be seen as a man who gave everything only to have it torn from him. Justice, though served in court, felt hollow to those who knew them both, because the true tragedy was not just the crime, it was the years of love and sacrifice that had led to it, unraveling in the worst way possible. And so the story closed not with satisfaction, but with reflection, on morality, on power, on the fragile threads that bind people together. It served as a reminder that justice can punish, but it cannot heal, that money can secure comfort, but it cannot buy loyalty or love, and that sometimes the greatest crimes are born not from strangers, but from the people we trust to love us the most.